I'm afraid this wedding is canceled. There will be no union today.
The feedback from the microphone shrieked through the cathedral, a jagged sound that made 300 elite guests flinch in their pews. Malcolm Kessler didn't just hesitate. He looked at Layla with a cold, corporate detachment that was more lethal than any physical blow. He didn't lower his voice. He wanted the world to hear. "This wedding was a merger I no longer require," Malcolm declared, his voice booming through the speakers. He reached out and snatched the ring back from Layla's trembling hand, the metal scraping her skin. "You were a loyal asset, Layla, but I've found a better investment. The wedding is off." He dropped the microphone with a hollow thud and stepped off the altar as if Layla were nothing more than a piece of discarded luggage. Layla Nwankwo didn't scream. She didn't chase him. She stood frozen in her intricate lace gown, the weight of 1,000 judging eyes pressing the air from her lungs. Tears carved tracks through her makeup as her white roses shook, petals drifting to the floor like snow on a grave. Every phone in the room was raised, capturing her ultimate disgrace for the morning headlines. But then, the heavy oak doors didn't just open. They were held wide by men with the disciplined posture of soldiers. Chairman Kang Jae-hoon moved down the center aisle with a predatory, fluid grace that silenced the whispers in an instant. The dragon of the underworld didn't look at the fleeing groom. His eyes were locked on Layla with an intensity that made the vast cathedral feel small. He reached the altar and stepped into the void Malcolm had left behind, his broad shoulders shielding Layla from the prying lenses of the crowd. He reached out, his gloved fingers tilting her chin up until she was forced to meet his dark, focused gaze. The dragon tattoo on his neck peeked from his collar, a silent promise of the violence he would inflict on anyone who dared to laugh at his expense. "You've spent 5 years organizing my life, Layla," Jae-hoon said, his low baritone vibrating through her soul. "It's time someone organized yours." "Chairman," Layla whispered, a single tear falling onto his black glove. "What are you doing?" Jae-hoon didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with a terrifying, ancient hunger. He turned his head slightly toward the priest, who sat paralyzed in shock. "The groom has forfeited his position," Jae-hoon declared, his voice ringing with the authority of a king. "And I have never been a man to let a high-value asset go to waste. I am the groom now. Continue the vows." "Hello, family, how are you doing? If your boss offered to marry you and destroy your toxic ex's life in one move, would you say, 'I do,' or walk away? Tell me in the comments, what would you do?" Subscribe to this channel if you are new here and also comment the city you are watching from. Now let's dive into the story. The air in the cathedral was thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of public disgrace. Layla Nwankwo stood at the altar, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps as the echo of Malcolm's rejection vibrated through the stone walls. 300 guests sat in a silence so absolute it felt heavy, their gazes like needles against her skin. She was the most efficient secretary in the city, a woman who lived by schedules and contingency plans, yet nothing in her files had prepared her for the moment her life became a viral tragedy. Then came the sound of the oak doors closing, not with a slam, but with a deliberate, heavy thud that commanded the room's attention. Kang Jae-hoon did not rush. He moved down the center aisle with the slow, terrifyingly calm pace of a man who was exactly where he intended to be. The chairman was a title the public knew, but the man Layla had served for 5 years was a mystery she had never quite unraveled. Today, that mystery felt dangerous. His black suit absorbed the morning light, and as he drew closer, the dark ink of the dragon tattoo on the side of his neck seemed to pulse against his collar. Layla watched him through a veil of tears, her mind a chaotic blur. She expected him to be at his office, perhaps reviewing the quarterly reports she had finished just hours before her wedding. Instead, he was here, looking at her with an intensity that made the vacuum of Malcolm's absence feel suddenly, violently filled. As he reached the front, he didn't stop at the pews. He stepped onto the elevated marble of the altar. He moved into the empty space Malcolm had left behind, his broad shoulders effectively blocking Layla from the prying eyes of the congregation. The sheer heat of his presence was an anchor, a physical barrier against the humiliation still pouring from the pews. "Chairman," Layla whispered, her voice a fragile thread, "you shouldn't be here. This is a disaster." Jae-hoon reached out, His hand was steady, his touch light as he brushed a stray, tear-soaked curl from her cheek. "I don't invest in disasters, Layla," he said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that somehow carried to the very back of the church without effort. "I invest in value, and Malcolm Kessler is the biggest fool I have ever had the displeasure of knowing." He turned his head slightly toward the priest. The elderly man was pale, his hands trembling against his prayer book. The entire room held its breath. "The ceremony isn't over," Jaihoon declared. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an executive order. But the groom," the priest stammered, his eyes darting toward the side door where Malcolm had vanished. "The groom has forfeited his position," Jaihoon said, his gaze returning to Layla. In that moment, the chairman persona cracked just enough for her to see something she hadn't recognized in 5 years of late-night meetings and morning coffees. It wasn't pity. It was a possessive, ancient hunger that had finally found its moment to strike. "And I have never been a man to let what belongs to me be discarded." He stepped closer, closing the distance until Layla could smell the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and cold rain that always clung to him. He took her hand, the one Malcolm had nearly bruised when he snatched the ring, and interlaced his fingers with hers. His grip was firm, warm, and absolute. "Continue," Jaihoon commanded, his voice ringing through the rafters like a bell. "I am the groom now, finish the vows." Layla felt the world tilt. She looked up into the eyes of the man she had called Sir for half a decade, the man whose secrets she guarded and whose coffee she made exactly the way he liked it. She saw the dragon on his neck, the cold steel in his gaze, and the silent promise of a protection so fierce it would burn the world to keep her safe. She had a choice: walk away as the woman the city pitied, or stay and become the woman the underworld feared. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she took a shuddering breath and squeezed back. "Proceed, father," Layla said, her voice finally finding its steel. The priest swallowed hard, looked at the dangerous man standing where a coward had been moments before, and began to read. But as the words of the ceremony filled the air once more, Layla caught a glimpse of Malcolm in the shadows of the vestibule. He had stopped to watch his handiwork, expecting to see her in ruins. Instead, he was staring at the man who had just taken his place. And for the first time in his life, Malcolm Kessler looked truly, deeply terrified. Jaihoon has secretly loved Layla for 5 years while she was dadding Malcolm. Do you think he was waiting for this wedding to fail, or did he plan this all along? I want to see your theories in the comments. The transition from the sacred, echoing cathedral to the interior of the blacked-out Merced's limousine felt like stepping from one reality into another. The heavy door clicked shut with a vacuum-sealed hiss, instantly severing the sounds of the frantic media outside, the flashing bulbs, the shouted questions, and the spectacle of the year. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of expensive leather, and the sharp, clean scent of the chairman's cologne. Layla sat in the plush rear seat, her voluminous white lace gown overflowing in the confined space like a trapped cloud. Her hands were still shaking, the adrenaline of the altar beginning to ebb, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache of shock. Beside her, Kang Jaihoon sat with his legs crossed, looking as composed as if he had just finished a routine board meeting instead of claiming his secretary as his wife in front of the city's elite. He didn't speak immediately. He reached into the cherrywood console and pulled out a leather-bound folder. He flicked it open, revealing the crisp, white parchment of a marriage certificate. There, in the dim light of the cabin, the names were already filled in: Kang Jaihoon and Layla Nwankwo. "The priest signed his portion before we left the vestry," Jaihoon said, his voice a low, steady baritone that vibrated through the quiet car. He didn't look at her, he was focused on the document. "All that remains is your signature." Layla looked at the pen he offered, a heavy, gold-nibbed fountain pen she had bought for him herself 3 birthdays ago. "Chairman," she whispered, her voice still thin and brittle. "Why did you do it? You didn't have to save me. I could have. I would have survived the embarrassment." Jaihoon finally turned to her. In the shadows of the limousine, the dragon tattoo on his neck looked almost alive. "Survival is for the weak, Layla. I don't want you to survive. I want you to prevail." He leaned in closer, his presence commanding and singular. "You have spent 5 years anticipating my every need. You have protected my interests, managed my secrets, and stood by my side when men twice your age flinched. You are not a woman who deserves to be a footnote in Malcolm Kessler's story." Layla reached out, her fingers brushing his as she took the pen. The warmth of his skin was a stark contrast to the icy numbness in her chest. She looked at the line where her name was to go. For 5 years, her signature had appeared on memos, flight manifests, and non-disclosure agreements. It had always been the signature of an employee, a ghost in the machinery of his empire. Signing this meant something else entirely. It meant she was no longer the help. She was the partner. She was the shield. And as she caught the glint of the tinted windows reflecting the dark world outside, she realized she was now part of the shadows he moved in. "If I sign this," she said, looking him in the eye, "the professional boundaries are gone. I won't just be your secretary anymore." "You haven't been just my secretary for a long time, Layla," he replied, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. "You were the only person in this city I trusted. Now you are the only person I am bound to. There is no going back to the office on Monday to file my taxes." Layla took a breath, the scent of the white roses in her lap mixing with the leather of the car. She thought of Malcolm's sneering face, the way he had tossed her aside like a failed investment. Then she looked at Jae-hoon, the man who had seen her value when she was invisible to everyone else. With a steady hand, she pressed the gold nib to the paper. The ink flowed smooth and black, anchoring her life to his. As she finished the final flourish of her name, Jae-hoon took the folder from her. He closed it with a definitive snap. "Drive," he commanded through the intercom to the partition. The limousine lurched forward, gliding away from the church and toward the heights of the city. Layla leaned back into the seat, the weight of the lace suddenly feeling less like a costume and more like armor. She looked down at her hand, and Jae-hoon reached over, covering her fingers with his. It wasn't a gentle hold, it was a claim. The realization hit her then, sharper than the betrayal. She hadn't just escaped a bad marriage. She had entered a kingdom. And in the world of Kang Jae-hoon, loyalty was the only currency that mattered, and the price of his protection was her entire soul. She wasn't an employee anymore. She was a Kang. And as the city lights blurred past the blacked-out glass, Layla realized the dragon didn't just save his queen, he kept her. The blacked-out limousine glided into the private subterranean entrance of a steel and glass skyscraper that pierced the very heart of the city's skyline. As the car came to a smooth halt, the door was opened from the outside by a man whose presence made the air feel suddenly thin. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in a tactical black suit, with an earpiece glinting like a shard of ice. He didn't look at Layla. He bowed deeply to Jae-hoon, his eyes fixed on the concrete floor. "Welcome home, Chairman," the man said, his voice a low, disciplined rasp. Jae-hoon stepped out first, extending a hand to Layla. As she took it, the heavy silk of her wedding gown rustled against the pavement, a stark, pristine white against the industrial shadows of the garage. Standing nearby were 4 more men, Han Min-seok and Young Tae-won among them, positioned with the lethal precision of sentries. They didn't move, they didn't blink, and they didn't smile. To Layla, they didn't look like executive security. They looked like soldiers in a war she hadn't realized was being fought. They were ushered into a private elevator that required both a biometric scan and a physical key held only by Jae-hoon. The ascent was silent and dizzying. When the doors finally slid open, Layla stepped out into a world that felt like a fever dream of glass and obsidian. The penthouse was a sprawling sanctuary of cold luxury, perched so high that the clouds seemed to drift past the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a space designed for a man who looked down on the world, not one who lived within it. But as Layla's eyes adjusted to the dim, amber-lit interior, she saw the details she had missed in the sterile environment of the office. On the mahogany sideboard sat a collection of ancient daggers, their blades shimmering with a wicked light. In the corner, a wall of monitors displayed flickering security feeds from across the city, ports, warehouses, and alleyways Layla had never seen on any corporate map. "This isn't just a home, is it?" Layla whispered, her voice echoing in the vast, open space. She turned to find Jae-hoon watching her, his coat discarded, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up to reveal the powerful muscles of his forearms. "The office is where I manage the legitimate interests of the Kang Group," Jae-hoon said, walking toward her with that slow, predatory grace. "This is where I manage the reality that makes those interests possible. You've spent 5 years looking at the ledgers, Layla. Now you're looking at the ink." He gestured to the window. Below them, the city was a grid of flickering lights, beautiful and chaotic. "Out there, people think the law keeps them safe. In here, we know the truth. Balance is kept by those with the strength to hold the scales. My men, Han and Jung, they aren't just bodyguards. They are the extensions of my will. Layla walked to the glass, her reflection ghost-like in her bridal lace. For years, she had been the gatekeeper to this man's schedule, thinking she knew his every secret. She had handled his private phone calls and organized his discreet meetings, but she realized now she had only been seeing the polished surface of a deep, dark ocean. The chairman wasn't just a titan of industry, he was the law of the shadows. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice right behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him, a silent, mounting pressure. Layla looked at her reflection, then at his. The dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to coil in the low light, a mark of a life lived in blood and loyalty. She thought of Malcolm, whose power came from a bank account and a name, and then she looked at Jae-hoon, whose power was etched into his very skin. "No," she said, her voice surprising her with its steadiness. "I spent 5 years wondering why the most powerful men in this country bowed to you before they ever saw your balance sheet. Now I understand." Jae-hoon stepped closer, his hand coming to rest on the glass beside her head, effectively pinning her between the city and his chest. "Most people run when they see the dragon, Layla. They want the protection, but they can't stomach the price." "I've never been most people, Chairman," she replied, turning to face him. The proximity was intoxicating, a mix of terror and a strange, new thrill. "You didn't marry a secretary today. You married the woman who kept your world running while you were in the trenches. I'm not going anywhere." A ghost of a smile touched Jae-hoon's lips, the first real emotion she had seen since the altar. It wasn't the smile of a boss. It was the look of a man who had finally found a partner who could look into the sun without blinking. "Good," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the ink on his neck before returning to her eyes. "Because in this house there are no secrets, only loyalty, and from tonight my enemies are your enemies. My world is your sanctuary, but it is also your cage if you ever betray that trust." As he walked away to answer a glowing red phone on his desk, Layla realized the contract she had signed in the car was far more binding than she had imagined. She wasn't just his wife. She was the consort to a king of the underworld, and as the guards outside the door shifted into a new formation, she knew her life as Layla N. Wankwo had truly ended. The sanctuary was beautiful, but it was built on a foundation of steel and secrets, and she was now the keeper of them all. The heavy silence of the penthouse was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner of the chairman's private study. Jae-hoon had been called away to the docks for an urgent discrepancy in a shipment, leaving Layla alone with the ghost of her former life as his secretary. Habit was a difficult thing to break. Even in her silk lounging robes, Layla found herself straightening the edge of his mahogany desk, her fingers tracing the familiar grain of the wood where she had placed his coffee every morning for 5 years. The study was a room she had entered 1,000 times, yet today it felt different, sacred and heavy with the weight of the man who owned it. She moved toward the back wall, where a shelf of leather-bound ledgers sat slightly askew. As she reached up to align them, her sleeve caught on a hidden latch behind the molding. With a soft click, a narrow, concealed drawer slid open at the base of the desk. Layla froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She shouldn't look. The dragon did not forgive trespassers, even those who shared his bed. But the drawer didn't contain weapons or ledgers of blood money. Inside lay a single, weathered manila folder, unmarked and worn at the edges. With trembling hands, she opened it. Her breath hitched. Inside was a collection of photographs, but they weren't the surveillance shots she expected of his enemies. They were of her. The first was a grainy, candid shot taken 5 years ago. It was her first day at the Kang Group. She was standing in the lobby, looking small and overwhelmed, clutching a cheap briefcase and wearing a suit that was 2 sizes too big. In the photo, she was smiling at a security guard, unaware that she was being watched. As she flipped through the stack, the realization hit her like a physical blow. There was a photo of her eating lunch alone in the park 3 years ago, a look of quiet determination on her face. There was a candid shot of her asleep at her desk during the grueling merger of 2024, a blanket draped over her shoulders that she had always assumed a cleaning lady had left behind. At the bottom of the pile lay a small, handwritten note on the back of a company memo. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably Jae-hoon's, sharp, precise, and commanding. It was dated the week she started. She is the only light in this gray building. I will wait until she is ready to see the sun. Layla sank into his oversized leather chair, the photos scattered across her lap. She had spent 5 years believing she was invisible to him, a mere tool in his vast empire. She had convinced herself that his occasional lingering gazes were just him waiting for a report, and that his protective nature was merely about preserving a high-value asset. She had been so focused on Malcolm's loud, shallow promises that she hadn't seen the quiet, burning devotion of the man standing right beside her. He hadn't married her at the altar just to save her from embarrassment. He hadn't stepped in because he needed a wife for his image. He had stepped in because he had been waiting 5 years for an opening, waiting for the moment she would finally be free of the man who didn't deserve her. The sound of the elevator chiming in the hallway made her jump. She scrambled to put the photos back, but her hands were shaking too hard. The heavy double doors of the study swung open, and Jae-hoon stepped in, the scent of rain and gunpowder clinging to his black overcoat. He stopped when he saw her sitting in his chair, the folder open on the desk. His eyes, usually so unreadable, flickered with a rare flash of vulnerability before settling into a hard, focused stare. He didn't move. The silence between them stretched, thick and charged with 5 years of unspoken truths. "I told you there are no secrets in this house, Layla," he said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. Layla looked up, a single tear tracing a path through the shock on her face. She held up the photo of her first day. "5 years, Jae-hoon. You've been watching me for 5 years." Jae-hoon walked toward her, his presence filling the room until the air felt heavy. He didn't apologize. He reached out and took the photo from her hand, his thumb brushing over her younger, smiling face. "Watching you was the only thing that kept me human, Layla. I watched you date men who didn't understand your worth. I watched you give your loyalty to a coward like Malcolm Kessler, and I waited." He leaned down, his face inches from hers, the dragon tattoo on his neck dark against his skin. "I was prepared to wait forever, but when he broke the heart I had been protecting from the shadows, I decided the wait was over." Layla looked at the man she had called Sir for half a decade, seeing him for the first time not as her boss, or even as her savior, but as a man who had loved her in the dark while she looked for light in all the wrong places. The fear she had felt earlier dissolved, replaced by a heat that rivaled the intensity in his gaze. "You're a terrifying man, Kang Jae-hoon," she whispered. "I am," he agreed, his hand coming to rest on the back of her neck, pulling her just a fraction closer. "But I am a man who keeps what is his, and now that you know, there is no going back to being just my secretary." The grand crystal ballroom was a shimmering cavern of old money and sharp secrets, the kind of place where reputations were built or butchered over a single glass of vintage champagne. For years, Layla Nwankwo had walked these halls 2 steps behind Jae-hoon, clutching a tablet and a schedule, a ghost in a sensible blazer. Tonight, the heavy gold and glass doors swung open, and the ghost was gone. Layla stepped into the light, her hand resting firmly on the sleeve of Jae-hoon's tuxedo. She wore a gown of midnight emerald silk that clung to her curves like a second skin, the fabric shimmering with thousands of hand-stitched crystals that caught the light with every breath. Her long, dark curls were swept back, revealing diamond chandelier earrings that grazed her collarbone, and her gaze, once lowered in professional deference, was now level and piercing. Beside her, Chairman Kang Jae-hoon moved with the terrifyingly calm grace of a king returning to his court. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at her, his possessive focus acting as a shield against the sudden, frantic whispers that erupted the moment they were spotted. "Deep breaths, Layla," Jae-hoon murmured, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. "You aren't here to serve them anymore. You own the room." Across the floor, near the towering ice sculpture, Malcolm Kessler stood surrounded by a circle of investors he was desperately trying to impress. He was laughing at a joke, the picture of arrogance, until the atmospheric shift of the room caught his attention. He turned, his glass halfway to his lips, and the color drained from his face so quickly it was as if a ghost had walked over his grave. Malcolm's eyes bulged as he took in the sight of the woman he had discarded like trash at the altar. She looked radiant, untouchable. But it was the man standing beside her that made Malcolm's hand begin to tremble. He had known Layla worked for the Kang Group, but he had assumed she was a disposable employee. Seeing her draped in the Kang diamonds, held by the man known as the Dragon of the Underworld, sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through his veins. Jaihoon guided Layla directly toward the center of the room, cutting through the social elite like a blade through silk. As they approached Malcolm's circle, the crowd parted instinctively. The investors, sensing the arrival of true power, immediately fell silent, their eyes darting between the chairman and the trembling man in their midst. "Malcolm," Jaihoon said, his voice smooth and cold as a winter morning. He didn't offer his hand. "I believe you've met my wife." The word wife hit Malcolm like a physical blow. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the silence. "Chairman," Layla, I didn't realize. "You didn't realize many things, Malcolm," Layla said, her voice steady and resonant. She didn't look at him with the heartbreak he expected. She looked at him with a profound, chilling pity. "You thought you were leaving me in the dirt. You didn't realize you were just clearing the path for someone who actually knows how to value a queen." Malcolm opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but Jaihoon stepped forward just an inch. The movement was subtle, but it projected a lethal promise. The dragon tattoo on Jaihoon's neck seemed to darken under the ballroom lights. "You treated a high-value asset with disrespect, Malcolm," Jaihoon said, his tone dropping to a dangerous register. "In my world, that is a mistake one rarely survives. You'll find that the merger you were so excited about has been reconsidered. My wife decided your company was no longer a sound investment." Malcolm's glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The investors around him immediately stepped back, physically distancing themselves from a man who had just been marked for ruin by the dragon. Layla felt a surge of something she had never felt before, not just the thrill of revenge, but the absolute safety of being protected by a man who moved mountains for her. She looked at Malcolm, whose face was now a sickly shade of gray, and realized the man who had shattered her heart was nothing more than a small, frightened boy playing at being a man. "Enjoy the party, Malcolm," Layla said softly, her smile sharp and beautiful. "It's likely the last one you'll be invited to." Jaihoon turned her away, his hand coming to rest protectively on the small of her back. As they walked toward the balcony, leaving the wreckage of Malcolm's social standing behind them, Layla realized her rebirth was complete. She wasn't the secretary anymore, and she wasn't the victim. She was the woman who had walked through the fire and found a dragon waiting on the other side. As they reached the cool air of the balcony, Jaihoon leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "You did well, Layla, but remember, the night is just beginning. Malcolm was the appetizer. The world is the main course." The cool night air on the balcony was a brief reprieve from the suffocating luxury of the gala, but the peace didn't last. Layla had stepped away from Jaihoon for only a moment to catch her breath, her fingers tracing the cold stone railing as she looked out over the city. The sound of heavy, uneven footsteps behind her made the hair on her arms stand up. She didn't need to turn around to know the smell of expensive bourbon and sour desperation. "You think you're so high and mighty now, don't you?" Malcolm's voice was slurred, jagged with a bitterness that rotted the air. Layla turned slowly, her emerald gown shimmering like a warning. Malcolm stood in the shadows of the arched doorway, his tie loosened and his eyes bloodshot. The polished groom from the altar was gone. In his place was a man who had watched his empire crumble in a single hour. "Go home, Malcolm," Layla said, her voice like ice. "You've embarrassed yourself enough for one lifetime." "Embarrassed myself?" Malcolm let out a harsh, barking laugh, taking a predatory step forward. "I made you. You were nothing but a girl with a clipboard until I looked at you, and now you're parading around with that thug. Do you have any idea who he really is? He's a killer, Layla, a monster." "He's the man who stayed when you ran," she shot back, her chin lifting. "He's twice the man you'll ever be." The truth was a spark in a powder keg. Malcolm's face contorted into a mask of pure, jealous rage. "You ungrateful little." Before she could scream, he lunged. His hand clamped around her upper arm, his fingers digging into her skin with a strength born of malice. He yanked her toward him, his other hand raising as if to strike the dignity right out of her face. "If I can't have you, I'll make sure he doesn't want what's left." Layla braced for the blow, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the strike never came. A shadow moved faster than her eyes could follow. A hand of solid iron intercepted Malcolm's wrist midair with a sickening crack. The sound of bone meeting resistance echoed against the stone walls. Malcolm let out a high-pitched shriek of agony as he was violently jerked away from Layla. Kang Jae-hoon didn't just step onto the balcony. He manifested from the darkness like an ancient, vengeful deity. The controlled intensity Layla was used to had evaporated, replaced by a raw, lethal coldness that made the temperature on the balcony drop. Jae-hoon didn't use a weapon. He didn't need one. He twisted Malcolm's arm behind his back with a clinical, terrifying efficiency, forcing the smaller man to his knees. Malcolm's face hit the stone floor with a dull thud. Jae-hoon's boot came down on the back of Malcolm's neck, pinning him like an insect to a board. "I warned you, Malcolm," Jae-hoon said. His voice wasn't loud. It was a low, guttural vibration that promised a slow death. "I told you she was mine. I told you she was untouchable." "Please," Malcolm wheezed, his face pressed into the grit of the balcony floor. It was a mistake. I'm drunk." "A mistake is a wrong number," Jae-hoon hissed, leaning down until his lips were inches from Malcolm's ear. The dragon tattoo on his neck looked dark and hungry in the moonlight. "Putting your hands on my wife is a death sentence." Jae-hoon reached down, grabbing Malcolm by the hair and slamming his head back against the stone one more time. Not enough to kill him, but enough to ensure he would never forget the taste of his own terror. The ruthless violence was quiet, precise, and absolute. There was no wasted movement, only the terrifying competence of a man who had built an empire on the broken bones of his enemies. "Jae-hoon, stop," Layla whispered, her voice trembling. He froze. For a second, his muscles remained coiled, a predator mid-kill. Then, slowly, the tension bled out of his shoulders. He didn't look at Malcolm again. He stepped back, smoothing the front of his flawless tuxedo jacket as if he hadn't just dismantled a human being. "Min-seok," Jae-hoon called out. From the shadows, his lead bodyguard appeared instantly. "Remove this trash," Jae-hoon commanded, his voice returning to its boardroom calm. "And ensure he is never able to walk into a room with a microphone again. I want him silenced, permanently." As the guards dragged a sobbing, broken Malcolm away into the darkness, Jae-hoon turned to Layla. The fire in his eyes softened the moment they landed on her. He reached out, his hands remarkably steady as he checked her arm for bruises. "Did he hurt you?" he asked, his voice thick with a protectiveness that bordered on worship. Layla looked at the man before her, the chairman, the boss, the dragon. She had seen the monster he kept hidden beneath the silk and diamonds, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the monster. She was afraid of what she would do to keep it by her side. "I'm okay," she breathed, stepping into his arms. "You came for me." Jae-hoon wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into the hard, safe heat of his chest. "I will always come for you, Layla. Heaven or hell, I will burn whoever touches you." As they stood together under the stars, the sounds of the gala continuing inside like a distant memory, Layla realized the truth. Malcolm had called Jae-hoon a monster, but he was wrong. Jae-hoon was a guardian, and in a world full of men like Malcolm, she would choose the dragon every single time. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, but it brought no warmth to the man kneeling on the cold obsidian floor. Malcolm Kessler looked like a ghost of the man who had stood at the altar a week ago. His designer suit was wrinkled, his jaw was bruised from the balcony floor, and his eyes were wide with the kind of primal terror that only comes from realizing you have reached the end of your rope. Jae-hoon sat behind his desk, the smoke from a single expensive cigar curling toward the ceiling. He wasn't looking at Malcolm. He was reviewing a series of digital files with the same detached focus he used for quarterly earnings. Layla stood beside him, her hand resting on the back of Jae-hoon's chair. She wore a tailored white dress, the color of a bride, but the cut of a general. She didn't look away from Malcolm's pathetic state. She had learned that in this house, mercy was not a gift. It was a calculation. "Please, Chairman," Malcolm croaked, his voice cracking. "I've lost the merger. My board of directors is calling for my resignation. Isn't that enough? You've ruined me." Jae-hoon finally looked up. The dragon didn't show anger. He showed nothing at all, which was far more terrifying. "You think this is about business, Malcolm? You think I care about your small-time merger or your mediocre company?" Jae-hoon stood up, his presence expanding until the room felt crowded. He walked around the desk, the rhythmic click of his shoes on the floor sounding like a countdown. "You didn't just break a contract," Jae-hoon said, stopping inches from the kneeling man. You tried to break a woman whose value you were too blind to see. You used a microphone to humiliate her. You used your hands to try and silence her. You enjoyed the audience, didn't you? Jae-hoon flicked a remote on his desk. A massive screen on the wall flickered to life. It showed a live feed of the stock market. Malcolm's company ticker was in a freefall, the numbers turning a violent, bleeding red. By the time the markets close today, your family name will be synonymous with bankruptcy. Your assets have been frozen. Your properties are being seized to cover the hidden debts my team discovered in your books. You can't do that, Malcolm gasped, trying to stand, but a heavy hand from Young Tae-won slammed down on his shoulder, forcing him back to his knees. I can, Jae-hoon whispered, leaning down. And I did, but that is just the wealth. Now let's discuss the dignity. Jae-hoon turned to Layla. He wants to know if he's paid enough, Layla. What do you think? Layla stepped forward. She looked down at the man who had once been her world, the man she had stayed late to help, the man whose ego she had spent years inflating at the cost of her own. She felt no satisfaction in his pain, only a deep, resonant sense of justice. You called me a business mistake, Malcolm, Layla said, her voice calm and absolute. You wanted everyone to see me as the woman who wasn't good enough, so I've decided to return the favor. She held up her tablet. Every social club, every investor, and every news outlet in the city has just received the footage from the balcony. They've seen the real Malcolm Kessler, the one who attacks women in the dark when he loses his money. You won't be a businessman anymore. You won't even be a socialite. You'll be a pariah. No one will take your calls. No one will offer you a seat. You will walk through this city and see exactly what I felt at that altar, total, suffocating isolation. Malcolm slumped, his forehead touching the cold floor. He was stripped bare. He had no money to hide behind and no reputation to protect him. He was a zero. This is the dragon's mercy, Malcolm, Jae-hoon said, his tone as sharp as a blade. I am letting you live. You will walk out of here with nothing but the clothes on your back. You will find a job, perhaps as a clerk or a delivery man. You will work until your hands are calloused, and every time you see a Kang Group logo, every time you see my wife's face on a magazine cover, you will remember the moment you decided to be a coward. Jae-hoon signaled his men. Throw him out, not through the private garage. Use the front entrance. Let the paparazzi have their final look at the man who thought he could touch what belongs to me. As the guards dragged a broken, sobbing Malcolm toward the elevator, the room fell into a heavy, peaceful silence. Jae-hoon turned back to Layla, the lethal hardness in his eyes melting into something soft and fiercely loyal. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw where she had once flinched. He will never bother you again, Jae-hoon promised. In this city, you are untouchable, not just because of my name, but because of your own. Layla leaned into his touch, the last of her past falling away with Malcolm's departure. She realized then that the dragon didn't just hoard gold. He guarded his treasure with a fire that consumed anything that dared to threaten it. She wasn't just safe, she was sovereign. Thank you, Jae-hoon, she whispered. He pulled her into his arms, his chin resting on top of her head. Don't thank me, Layla. You're the one who survived the fire. I'm just the one who made sure the world saw you burn brighter than the flames. The aftermath of Malcolm's final ruin left a strange, heavy stillness in the penthouse. The high-stakes adrenaline had faded, leaving Layla and Jae-hoon alone in the vast, amber-lit study. Jae-hoon stood by the window, his back to her, watching the city he moved like a chessboard. He looked every bit the untouchable chairman, yet Layla could still feel the phantom heat of the photographs she had found in his desk, the evidence of 5 years of silent, agonizing devotion. The employee wall that had stood between them for half a decade was crumbling, but the silence remained. Layla took a breath, the silk of her dress rustling as she stepped closer to him. You did all of this, she began, her voice steady but soft. You waited for me, you watched me, you even kept a blanket on me when I fell asleep at my desk 3 years ago. Jae-hoon's shoulders tensed. He didn't turn around, but his reflection in the glass was sharp and shadowed. I told you, Layla, I protect what is mine. But I wasn't yours then, she countered, stepping into his personal space until she could see the pulse jumping in his neck, right beside the dark ink of the dragon. I was just your secretary. I was dating a man who treated me like an accessory. Why didn't you say anything? Why did you let me walk into that church with him? Jae-hoon finally turned, and the intensity in his gaze was enough to make her heart skip. The cold, calculating boss was gone, replaced by a man who looked raw, almost wounded by his own secrets. He didn't reach for her. He kept his hands clenched at his sides, as if afraid that touching her would break the last of his restraint. "Because I am a monster, Layla," he said, his voice dropping to a guttural, pained whisper. "Look at this house. Look at the men downstairs with guns. Look at the blood on the hands that would have held yours. I knew what I was. I knew that the moment I pulled you into my world, your peace would be over. You were light, and I was the thing that lived in the dark." He took a step toward her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "Every morning you brought me coffee. You smiled at me with a heart that was pure. I told myself that if I loved you, I would stay away. I would let you have your normal life with your normal fiancé. I thought that by staying silent, I was saving you from myself." Layla felt a tear escape, tracing a path down her cheek. "You thought Malcolm was saving me. He was destroying me, Jai-hoon. He didn't see me at all. You were the only one who actually looked." "I looked too much," Jai-hoon groaned, finally reaching out. His thumb caught the tear on her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man who had just dismantled an empire. "I spent 5 years in a self-imposed hell. I sat through board meetings listening to you speak, wanting to pull you across the table and tell the world you were mine. But I couldn't. I was your employer. I had power over your career, your livelihood. If I had spoken then, you wouldn't have known if you loved me, or if you were just afraid to say no to the chairman." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "I wanted you to choose me freely, but when I saw him stand at that altar and try to strip you of your dignity, I realized my silence wasn't protecting you, it was failing you. I didn't care about the rules anymore. I didn't care about the scandal. I just knew that if I didn't step in, I would lose the only thing that made me want to be a better man." Layla reached up, her fingers finally tracing the lines of the dragon tattoo on his neck. It wasn't a mark of a monster to her anymore. It was the mark of a guardian who had sacrificed his own peace to wait for her. The professional boundaries didn't just crumble, they vanished. "I wasn't afraid to say no to the chairman, Jai-hoon," she whispered against his lips. "I was afraid to say yes to the man behind the desk because I didn't think I was enough for him." Jai-hoon let out a shaky breath, his arms finally winding around her waist and pulling her flush against his chest. "You were always more than enough. You were everything." In that moment, the vulnerable surrender was complete. It wasn't just Layla surrendering to his world, but Jai-hoon surrendering his heart. The dragon had let down his guard, and for the first time in 5 years, the secretary and the boss were gone. There was only Layla and Jai-hoon, 2 souls finally speaking the same language in the quiet of the night. 1 year had passed since the day the cathedral doors had closed on Layla Enwankwo's old life, but the woman standing on the terrace of the Kang estate was unrecognizable from the heartbroken secretary who had once clutched a bouquet of dying roses. The city lights twinkled below like a carpet of diamonds, but tonight, they weren't the focus. Tonight, the world was silent, save for the soft rustle of the wind through the gardens and the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the man standing behind her. Layla wore a gown of pure, liquid gold silk that shimmered under the moonlight, a gift from a husband who no longer saw her as an asset to be managed, but as the soul of his empire. There were no flashing cameras here, no prying eyes of the social elite, and no whispers of scandal. The only witnesses were Han and Young, standing at a respectful distance in the shadows, their presence no longer a sign of danger, but a familiar comfort. Jai-hoon stepped forward, his reflection catching in the glass doors. He had discarded his tie, his black shirt open at the collar to reveal the edge of the dragon tattoo that Layla had come to know as intimately as her own reflection. He didn't approach her with the cold authority of the chairman. He moved with a quiet, reverent hesitation that belonged only to her. "1 year ago, I gave you a ring because I couldn't stand to see you empty-handed," Jai-hoon said, his baritone voice grounding her in the present. "I gave it to you out of duty. I gave it to you to save your face." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. When it clicked open, a rare, flawless blue diamond caught the moonlight, radiating a fire that put the city lights to shame. It was a stone of strength, of rare beauty, and of unshakable clarity. "I don't want you to wear that first ring anymore," he continued, taking her hand in his. His touch was no longer the steel grip of a protector, but the tender anchor of a man who had finally found his home. That ring belonged to a secretary who was saved by her boss. This one belongs to the woman who saved the man behind the desk. Layla looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with tears that had nothing to do with pain. Over the last year, she had seen the dragon at his most ruthless and his most vulnerable. She had stood beside him as he navigated the treacherous waters of the underworld, and she had sat with him in the quiet hours of the night when the weight of his crown grew too heavy. She had realized that while he had given her his name, she had given him his humanity. "I didn't just marry you to survive, Jaihoon," Layla whispered, her voice carrying the strength of a woman who finally knew her own worth. "I stayed because I found the only person who looked at me and saw a queen before I even had a crown." Jaihoon took the new ring and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, a silent, glittering vow. "Layla Kang," he said, the name sounding like a prayer on his lips. "You are not my employee, you are not my subordinate, you are my equal, you are my heart, and I will spend every sunrise for the rest of my life proving that the dragon belongs only to you." He didn't wait for her to answer with words. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw with a fierce, protective love. When he kissed her, it wasn't the desperate, hurried kiss of their wedding day. It was a slow, deep sealing of a pact, a promise that no matter how messy, dangerous, or complicated their world became, they would face it as one. The betrayal at the altar a year ago felt like a lifetime away, a distant shadow that had only served to lead her into the light. Malcolm Kessler was a ghost, a forgotten footnote in a story that had become an epic. As Layla leaned into Jaihoon's chest, the scent of sandalwood and rain wrapping around her like a shield, she knew this was her real wedding. There was no microphone, no audience, and no public spectacle. There was only a man, a woman, and a dragon standing together at the top of the world, ready to rule the shadows together. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and as the moon climbed higher in the sky, Layla realized that she hadn't just been saved, she had been found. Malcolm thought he was throwing Layla away, but he ended up giving her the keys to a kingdom. On a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied were you to see the dragon strip Malcolm of everything? And if you were Layla, would you have been as merciful, or would you have demanded more? Let me know in the comments.